Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog. Today I'm going to show you how to do a two-color chained cast on. You're going to need a crochet hook for this method, but you don't necessarily need to know how to crochet. Also, the size of your crochet hook isn't going to be extremely critical because it's only used as a tool and not as a device to measure your stitches. I'm using the two-color chain cast on to start a double knitting project. My burst into bloom scarf. But this technique could be used to cast on other colorwork projects where you want your first row of stitches to alternate between two colors. After demonstrating the cast on, I'll show you two ways to deal with the final cast on stitch because a chained cast on is a little bit different than other cast on methods we use, especially when you're working with alternating colors. Let's get started. Before we begin, if you enjoy our videos, consider joining the pack and becoming a member of thechilidog.com for ad-free access to our entire learning library, priority support, and more. Like many cast-ons, we're going to start by making a slip knot with both of our yarns held together. And that loop from the slip knot is placed on our crochet hook, and we want to make sure that it tightens up when we're pulling on our working yarns, not pulling on the yarn tails. And you also want to make sure not to pull it too tightly. You just want the loops to be hugging the crochet hook, not strangling it. The crochet hook is going to be held in our right hand. And I also like to scoop up the yarn tail and hold it in my right hand so that it's out of the way and doesn't get caught up as I'm casting my stitches. The working yarns are to the left. I'm also going to hold my knitting needle with the right hand to the left of the crochet hook, and it is over both of the working yarns. It's really helpful as you're casting on to keep the crochet hook and the knitting needle close together. We're going to cast on by alternating yarns, and you start with whichever yarn is closest to you. So in this case, it's my blue yarn. I'll cast on my first stitch by wrapping the blue yarn over the knitting needle, over the hook, behind the hook, and behind the needle. Then I kind of need to hold everything in place so that I can use my hook to draw this wrap through the original two slip knot loops. And if you've tightened up that slip knot too much, it can be really hard to pull it through. My first stitch is cast on. See, things are a little bit fidgety here as you get going. I'm going to cast on the next stitch. The purple yarn is closest to me. I'm going to wrap the yarn over the needle, over the hook, behind the needle, and then use the hook to draw the wrap through the loop. Blue, over the needle, over the hook, behind the needle, and draw the wrap through. As you're casting on, you want to pay attention to your tension. You don't want things to tighten up too much. So as you're wrapping your stitches, just make sure that you're not pulling the yarn that you're wrapping too tightly, or these loops along the edge will tighten up too much, and you don't want that to happen. So you can tighten them up a little bit, but don't go crazy. Wrap the yarn and pull it through. And if you're a crocheter, you may already recognize what's happening with your crochet hook. You're really just making a crochet chain along the edge of your knitting. Oops. So you would just continue casting on in this manner until you have cast on the desired number of stitches onto your knitting needle. After you've cast on your stitches, you need to do something with this loop that remains on your crochet hook. If you just remove the hook, as soon as you pull on the working yarn, it's going to tighten up that loop And eventually you will unravel this chain along the edge of your cast on and you'll lose your cast on stitches. So the good news is you have two easy options to fix this problem. Option one is to cast on one less stitch than your pattern calls for. Then when you lift the loop from the crochet hook up onto your knitting needle and pull the working yarn to tighten things up, you have the correct number of stitches on your needle. You just need to remember as you start knitting across that first row, you'll need to knit your first stitch with the opposite color as the loop so that you can maintain your alternating color pattern. Option two is similar, but in this case, you would cast on the actual number of stitches that your pattern calls for. And then, like before, you'd lift this loop up onto your knitting needle and tighten things up by pulling on the working yarn. In this case, you now have an extra stitch on your knitting needles. So to take care of that, as you start knitting your first row, you would treat the first stitch and the second stitch as if they were one, and you would simply work them together. Whichever option you choose, there's one final issue that you need to deal with, and that is as you're casting on your stitches, your two yarns are going to twist around each other. So before you knit that first row of stitches, it's very helpful to hold your working yarns, let your knitting needle dangle, and gravity will untwist the two yarns from each other so that you can start knitting. I hope you enjoyed learning how to do a two-color chain cast on. If you'd like to try this technique in a pattern, head over to the shop section of thechilidog.com and look for my Burst into Bloom scarf. Until we stitch again, happy knitting.